Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Meta Technologies webinar. And in this case, we're going to be covering a building airflow simulation using AKL's Flow Designer software. My name is Sheyi Shambore, and I will be guiding you through today's webinar. All right, so just give it a second here while we share a screen and wait for some attendees to jump on, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so we'll go ahead and dive in. So again, we're going to be talking about building airflow simulation using AKL Flow Designer. And we'll just, quickly skip to, a very quick agenda for today. So we're going to first off start with a quick introduction of who we are, who Boundary Systems is, and who AKL is. And then we'll talk about, very quickly just the need for building airflow simulation, right? And then finally, we'll introduce Flow Designer, the software, what it can do, and we'll also then go through a live demonstration of the software. All right, so who is Meta Technologies and who's AKL? So first off, Meta Technologies is a consulting company based out of Cleveland, Ohio, and we resell many different software offerings that are primarily used by the building information modelers, the architecture, mechanicals, and people in the sort of the civil or the construction industry that need software to achieve, whatever tasks they have, whether it's in building design. Um, we have software that can help, do that at, very competitive pricing. So some of the people that we have partnered with, for example, are ZW Soft, which essentially offers an AutoCAD clone at less than half the price of AutoCAD. And so again, our customers that use that can be, just as productive as if they were using the real deal, but again, much more cost effective, right? In this example here, what we're going to be talking about is Flow Designer, and so that is our partner with that is AKL Labs, and AKL stands for Advanced Knowledge Laboratories. It's a company based out of Japan, and they've spent years and decades actually working in the area of building and airflow simulation, right? And so they have a flagship product called Flow Designer that is currently being used by 15 or so or even more of the top 20 architecture firms in Japan, right? So it's a software that is very well respected in its field and what it can do. And we're going to bring that to you here, show you what it is and how it works and what it does. And again, hopefully you can get some valuable insight from it. All right, so by way of, I guess, just starting off a conversation here, I'll just lead off with this picture. Some of you may see this picture and it immediately, rings a bell and you know what it is, and some of you, may not even be able to identify with it. Well, this is the John Hancock Tower, or I guess formerly called the John Hancock Tower in Boston. And this building was, famous for a few different things. One is that it broke many architectural, design practices and standards in many good ways, back in its time when it was, constructed in the 1970s. And so it's known in a positive way for that. But the other is that it's also known for some of the, engineering flaws that were not considered in the design, or at least were evident in the construction of the building afterwards. One of which, for example, you'll notice is that the building essentially consists of two flat, almost rectangular, but in this case they're actually a parallelogram, panels of building, and then the middle section, which in this image here looks pretty dark, the middle section is almost essentially open, right? And so that looks like it's almost like you have two flat panels with a tunnel in between, right? Well, one of the things they realized after the building was constructed is when wind speeds in that region reach a certain velocity, the forces of the wind start to exert such a great pressure on the building itself that the building almost starts to twist, right? And so after the building was constructed, about, I don't know, somewhere between $6 to $8 million was spent reinforcing the building, right? And installing some tuned mass dampers just to mitigate the effects of the wind and how it interacted with the building, right? Something that, good simulation, before the design had ever been constructed would have, spotted out or at least pointed out, and you'd be able to mitigate that effect in the design phase rather than having to spend, millions of dollars after the building's been constructed mitigating that issue, right? And so it's because of things like these that FlowDesigner essentially exists in the industry. And we'll speak to what FlowDesigner is and what it does right here. So FlowDesigner is a very easy to use flow simulation software that allows you to take any existing BIM data, right? So whether it be data from Revit or ArchiCAD or Vectorworks, really any software that allows you to create the BIM data of a building, or even some concept tools like Rhino and Google SketchUp, right? It doesn't have to be anything fully detailed, right? It can just be a rough, space claim of a building, what it's going to look like, and things like that. You can bring that into FlowDesigner and then start to understand, what the airflow pattern around the building is going to look like, and also inside the building as well. So you can do some internal analyses, external analyses, or a combination of the two, as you can see here in this screenshot, right? And the beauty of that then is with FlowDesigner, you can then start to take a look at areas of your model that are going to experience, very high or very low flow, and that can then give you some insight into, design decisions that you can make. For example, in the case of the John Hancock building, maybe something as simple as just changing the orientation of the building, right? If you have some design freedom on the lot that you have, changing the orientation, maybe a couple of degrees, because the way the building may hit it at a certain orientation may be less advantageous as compared to if you rotate the building a couple of degrees, and then that may be better for it, right? And so those are the kinds of things that you can start to visualize with AKL Flow Designer. And so at this point, I'll pause here and I'll show a quick demonstration using FlowDesigner. All right, thanks for your patience there while I was switching screens. So this is AKL Flow Designer, right? So it's again desktop run software, nothing too special or fancy that you'd need a server for, anything like that. And the software is very easy to use. So for example, first off, I have this, sample house. It's created in a BIM software, right? Um, First thing to know about FlowDesigner is that it supports import of data from, many different software packages like Rhino or Google SketchUp, that are just sort of simple conceptual design tools in the BIM world, right? But it also supports the import of IFC data as well, which is almost like I guess you'd say a neutral file that is supposed to be readable across multiple different BIM softwares, right? So, if you're talking about currencies, right, the euro would be a neutral currency that any country in the EU would accept, right? The IFC is intended to be the euro for across BIM softwares that any one of them can accept, and so FlowDesigner supports the IFC format, and so regardless of what software you use, as long as you can export an IFC file, you can use FlowDesigner, right? And in this case, we'll go ahead here and hit OK, and FlowDesigner is going to start importing that building. And in this case here, so you'll notice I can now start to define, my analysis domain. In this case, it's going to be an external analysis, and we'll go ahead and accept that. And yep, once we save, FlowDesigner is now going to start the import of that building. All right. Now, I was mentioning the example of the John Hancock building, and some of you may have thought, well, that's all fine and dandy, but you know, I'm not going to be creating anything as fancy as a John Hancock building, right? That's perfectly fine as well, right? You still have wind load considerations for even smaller buildings as well, right? Now, in this case, this example, this is just a two-story building, right? And I believe this is just over 20 feet or so, somewhere around there, 20, 25 feet, right, in vertical elevation. And again, we're going to go ahead and do just a very quick wind simulation on this building right here. All right, and I'll just go ahead and just hide a couple of the components so we can get a peek as to what's inside as well. So I go ahead and do that, and I just hide the roof of the building. You'll notice it's just the internal space with and that's the staircase, right there in the middle down there, which is one of the things about FlowDesigner is that your BIM model doesn't have to be fully detailed or final in any way, right? You don't have to have, where the kitchen is going to go or things like that in here. You can just have a rough, building envelope and still be able to bring that into FlowDesigner and start to analyze it to get an understanding of what's going to happen, with the airflow. All right. The other thing I like about FlowDesigner, and one of the reasons why it's so cool to use, is that is the fact that what's it called? You have is the fact that you have a lot of I guess you'd say wizard-driven menu clicks, right? So an easy example of that would be, say for example, I want to set up the wind simulation, or I guess the wind loading on this building, right? It's as simple as configuring not the analysis range. Yeah, it's as simple as configuring my analysis values and saying, in this case, for example, I'm interested in flow and not temperature currently, right? And this is going to be a steady state analysis, so I'm looking at the results as they even out over a certain snapshot in time, and not looking at it over a time varying a range. And then finally, I can specify my external wind conditions, right? And you'll notice the wizard is already set up very easy for you, to where you can specify what your terrain type is, right? So if you're in a suburban area, or if you're like a major city center, and the way the wind is going to flow to the building and around it is going to be affected by the surrounding buildings, right? FlowDesigner can take that into account. You can also then specify, where the wind is coming from, or the wind direction with just this very simple, wind vane diagram, right? And so you can either select, a specific direction from here, or you can also, input, numerical direction in degrees, right? You can specify, in X number of degrees that the wind direction is going to be coming from, right? In this case, we're going to specify it's from this direction over here. And we'll say our wind speed is going to be, it's about 3 meters per second. Observe that at 10 meters from the ground up there. All right. And once I've set that up, you'll notice, there's that blue arrow that points me to, that denotes the fact that that's where my wind is coming from, right? And really, that's all I need, right? So in just a couple of mouse clicks, I already, imported the model, right? FlowDesigner already automatically set up my my analysis envelope based on the fact that it's an external analysis. And with just a couple of clicks, I set up my wind simulation, and I'm good to go, right? The only other thing to do in this case is I'll go ahead and generate my mesh real quick. And again, FlowDesigner does that in a way that's incredibly easy and really painless in how it meshes. And so with just a couple of clicks again, I've gone ahead and I've created my mesh, and now I can go ahead and start to analyze this model, right? Now in this case, we'll go ahead and do a very quick analysis with this, and we'll hit OK, right? And now FlowDesigner is going to start calculating the airflow around this building, right? Now, some of you may notice this or realize that I'm currently running the simulation live, right, on air in this webinar, which is something that you typically don't see often, right? Typically, you'll have cases where, people, start setting up a simulation and then, pull out some prepared results for you, right? That's not it in this case. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because FlowDesigner is incredibly quick, right? This analysis solves in about 50-something seconds, right, for an entire building. And the reason that's so wonderful now is, for a lot of architects and structural engineers, one of the things we usually hear is, well, all this airflow stuff is stuff that's very detailed, requires a lot of horsepower and brain power to to do, and we reserve it for much later on in the design phase, and we spend a huge amount of effort and time into doing that, right? Well, with FlowDesigner, you don't have to do that, right? Yes, FlowDesigner can do some very advanced things, right, that can support in the design phase, in the simulation phase, but just as a concept tool starting out of the gate to get an understanding of how do we want to orient this building on the lot, and get an understanding of how the air is flowing around and into this building, FlowDesigner can do that very easily, right? And again, in about a minute, right, the software is done, right? And so this isn't something that takes hours and hours of churning just to get some results. And that's one of the things that makes the software stand out and is very unique, is that in a minute of runtime in this example here, or in many other cases, very quickly, you can start to get results that you can interrogate and derive very good design insights from. All right. So in this case here, we're currently in the results viewer right now, and there are many different options for interrogating the data. In this case, I'll just start off with this fringe plot right here, and you'll notice if I go ahead and move this over, you'll notice that the data I get is some vectors showing the wind direction, right, and how it flows around the building, right? The fact that right over here, there's going to be some sort of a vortex effect, right? As I have the airflow coming out here, and the air then recirculating around like that. You can also get to see areas of, lower versus higher airflow, right? Relative to each other. And this can then give you an understanding of, yeah, what the building is going to do and how it's going to look, and how the air is going to affect the building, right? Now in this case, we also have some contour lines, right, with specific values. So that essentially gives you an idea of, what the flow speed is at different areas of that fringe plot, right? And so now you can start to glean some pretty valuable design insights from, from the airflow pattern, in this case, as shown. And now the cool thing about FlowDesigner is that not only can you start to, interrogate the airflow outside of the building as is currently, but you can also start to interrogate and take a look at what's going on inside of the building as well. So for example, in this case, I deactivated the windows, right, earlier before setting up the simulation, just so that way, as the air is flowing, from the outside, FlowDesigner will take a look at, okay, what happens if all the windows were open, right? Or, we could also, deactivate some of the windows and not all of them. But in this case, now FlowDesigner is showing you, okay, what happens as air is flowing through from this direction, and it then gets into this living space, right? And then it flows out, or getting an understanding of right over here, right? And how air flows into that window, and then it can flow out of this guy over here, right? And so now this can start to inform your design on getting adequate ventilation, right, into a building, right? Making sure there's adequate cross ventilation, right? And getting areas of getting rooms where there's very good airflow within the room, right? And again, all of this just from a very simple, very quick 1-minute analysis inside of FlowDesigner. All right. So that essentially covers what we're going to talk about regarding FlowDesigner, the software, what it is and what it does, and the fact that, again, it's very simple and easy to use, and with minimal time investment, you can start to run analyses on how the airflow is moving around your buildings and start to get very meaningful data that you can then use to inform your building design, right? And FlowDesigner can work, very early on in the concept stage of a building, right? Before you have a lot of things committed down or set in stone, right? And FlowDesigner can also work in a very in-depth analysis stage as well, and we can show some examples of that in future webinars. But again, what all this means is that you're able to, not shy away from the cost or the investment of analyzing your designs, early on in the process and getting an understanding of how your building is gonna interact with the airflow around it. But now this is, a much lower barrier to where you can start to analyze that very quickly and get an understanding of what the airflow will do, and now have that inform your design decisions. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about in today's webinar. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you on a future edition of Meta Technologies webinar Wednesdays. Thank you, and have a great one.